Thank you. Can I just say I'm pleased to be convening the 7th meeting of this session between the Conveners Group and the First Minister. I'd like to welcome the First Minister to today's meeting. And like everyone who's come to watch the session today, apologies from Jenny Mara, Convener of Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny, from Bill Kidd of Standards and Procedures, and Graham Simpson, Convener of Delegated Powers and Law Reform, who are unable to attend today and have sent their apologies. And as you all know, this gives you the opportunity to question the First Minister about the programme for government from the perspective of your committee. We have up to 2 hours for today's session. I propose to give each convener around 6 minutes to ask their questions with answers, but there is time, as I will explain, in hand if you want to develop a little bit. And there are other issues that may cut across other conveners, so that if you want to come in with a supplementary, just indicate and I'll call you in, but it must be on point. It must be to do with the issue being discussed. We need to finish by around 1:55 at the very latest, because Chamber business starts at 2. And if we have time at the end, before 1:55, and you've got any supplementaries, of course, you can ask them. Do you wish to make any opening remarks, First Minister?
No, I'm happy just to get on with it.
Thank you very much. So I'll call the first convener, and that's Gillian Martin, Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform. Ms Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Good afternoon, First Minister. Your government's committed to very challenging emissions reduction targets in the Climate Change Act, but we know that climate change will happen as a result of cumulative emissions and pollution from countries all across the world, many of whom have not put forward stretching targets. So my committee last week was warned that Scotland could be facing very severe effects of climate change. That was the UK Committee for Climate Change where we're up giving evidence. And they've told us that we should be working on a long-term assumption of a rise in temperature of 3 to 4 degrees. Weather events becoming more extreme, affecting human and environmental health, real concern. Is the government producing plans across all portfolios and allocating funding on climate change adaptation and the mitigation of the effects of climate change, which take those potential future scenarios into account?
In short, yes, we are, and I'll come on to a little bit more detail on that in a second. I think the first thing to say, though, which is alluded to in your question, is that it is, I think, a moral obligation on all of us to do everything we can to limit temperature rises and to live up to the ambitions of the Paris Agreement. And in fact, the recent legislation that Parliament passed to increase the scale of the emissions reductions targets in Scotland exceeds what the Paris Agreement would have us do. So I think it's important that we lead by example. You're absolutely right. Scotland, a relatively small country, we cannot on our own limit global rises in temperature, but if we are not showing the leadership, then we lack the authority to encourage other countries to do likewise. So I think that action and that ambition is really important. But there is, I think, a lot of power in the view that we are going to feel the effects of climate change. You only have to look at some of the severe weather events being experienced right now in some parts of the UK to know that we are in many respects already living with the impact of climate change. So climate adaptation is just as important to run in parallel to the work we're doing to reduce emissions. So as you will be aware, we have already laid before Parliament our new 5-year adaptations programme, which overall sets out, I think, 170 policies and proposals across all sectors of government. So the key objective of that programme is to embed a cross-sectoral, cross-government outcomes-based approach, which draws very heavily on the UN Sustainable Development Goals and our own national performance framework, so that every area of government has to have this very much to the fore. In terms of, I mentioned the 170 policies. If we look at funding, I mean, there'll be different funding streams attached to different policies. But for example, if we take flooding, which is obviously and tragically very topical right now, it will invest over £400 million over the next 10 years to protect homes, particularly in areas that are flood prone. So that's a concrete example of the kind of work we need to do. in the early year, in the first year in particular of the adaptation programme, there will be a bit of focus on research work so that we are informing ourselves on the further work we need to do, and that will be a key part of how we address some of the recommendations that the adaptation subcommittee of the Committee on Climate Change made. So it's very much a priority, and as you put to me, the importance of embedding that right across government can't be overstated.
What do you make of that?
Let me call you so it's just where you are. Gillian Martin.
What do you make of that scenario, that really stark warning of an increase of 3 to 4 degrees? We're warned that it could be like, 40-degree summers in Glasgow. That could mean that buildings don't have the kind of cooling infrastructure in there, roads would be affected. I mean, when you heard that, what did you make of that?
Well,
First Minister.
I think like everybody else, it alarms and concerns me, but it also really reinforces the determination I think we all have to have, and I certainly have, to play our part in trying to get to a situation where that is not inevitable. I don't underestimate the difficulty of that, but it really does underline the importance of Scotland playing its full part. I mean, obviously, what you've just quoted at me there comes from experts, so none of us can ignore that, but obviously a key part of the Paris Agreement is in limiting those temperature rises, and we've got to focus on that while we take the action we need to take to equip our communities to deal as best they can with the impacts of the kind of temperature rises that are being warned about.
Thank you. Lewis MacDonald, Health and Sport Committee, please.
Thank you very much. First Minister, you'll be aware of the primary care inquiry which the Health and Sport Committee is undertaking, and in particular of our public panel sessions in Inverurie and Cambuslang and Dunfermline, to find out what the public think primary care should look like for the next generation. A very strong theme of all 3 public panel sessions, indeed of our consultation more generally, was that the public think that healthcare should be using all the technologies and all the electronic means at our disposal. People would like to engage with their healthcare professionals by email. They would like to be able to make appointments online. They would like medical professionals across the health service to have access, equal access to their medical records, subject to their own agreement, of course, but equal access so that the patient doesn't have to keep repeating the same story to one professional after another. Do you think the public are right to want that, and what can the government do to achieve that?
Yes, I do. In short, firstly, I really welcome the committee's focus on primary care, because I think as we look ahead to the challenges and solving the challenges of increasing demand on health services, shifting more of the balance of care into the community and into primary care is really important, and the primary care improvement plan work that the government is leading is a really important part of this. When people traditionally think of primary care, they think about general practitioners, and they will always be at the heart of that, but increasingly it's the multidisciplinary teams that are vital. I was visiting a community pharmacist just a week or so ago, and seeing the investment and the wider range of services that they're able to deliver is really impressive. In terms of the electronic access to healthcare, I think I know there are a number of really important and impressive initiatives that have been undertaken over a number of years to give people access to electronic appointments, to join up patient records between different parts of the health service. All of that is vitally important. I speak from my experience as Health Secretary when I say it's not straightforward, and it raises a whole host of complexities, not just technical and technological complexities, but it also takes you into areas of data and patient privacy and confidentiality. So these can be big challenges, but it's absolutely vital. Most people are used to conducting quite large swathes of their lives now online, and our health service can't be and shouldn't be immune from that. Obviously, technology gives us different ways of delivering healthcare in some of the remoter parts of the country as well.
Lewis MacDonald.
You're right to say that the NHS has been struggling with this for a number of years. We're not there yet. Is it time for greater urgency in ensuring this technological prize is achieved for patients and for the health service?
First Minister.
I wouldn't want to sound complacent here. I guess both going back to my experience as Health Secretary, but also in the what I see as First Minister when I visit different parts of the health service in different parts of the country, I don't know that there is a lack of urgency or a lack of priority around this. I think some of the challenges are very real. The health service in Scotland is not unique in facing those. Actually, health services are not unique in facing some of those challenges. So there is, I think, a real momentum behind it, and I think we've got to continue to push it forward. We'll await with interest the report and any recommendations from your committee, and we'll obviously give them very serious consideration.
You mentioned in answer to an earlier, in your first answer, the importance of the multidisciplinary team. Clearly, the programme for government set out an objective of 800 additional GPs over a period of time. That target was set before the new GP contract. The multidisciplinary team has grown, I think, in importance. Is that a number that should be reviewed, or should you be setting targets for other professions that work with GPs in order to deliver better primary care?
Well, I think it was felt, and rightly felt, that it was important in terms of the GP workforce that we focus very much on increasing the numbers in general practice. So I think that target is right. I would say generally we should always keep any targets and any numbers under review to make sure that they are reflective of the situation we're in. But that's an important target and one that we're focused on meeting. But I do think it's really important that we don't, when we talk about primary care, we don't just talk about GPs, because actually recruiting more GPs is a key part of reducing the workload pressures that GPs face just now, but so too is taking away some of the duties and responsibilities that traditionally have been done by GPs and allowing other members of the wider primary care workforce to do. And obviously we've got the commitment, which we will meet, of investing an additional £500 million a year in primary care by the end of this Parliament. That is primary care in its widest sense. About half of that will go to general practice, but it's important that we see primary care in its widest sense. And I think that helps GPs with some of the challenges they're dealing with, as well as having that focus on increasing numbers in general practice.
Joan McAlpine, Culture, Tourism, European External Relations, please.
Thank you and good afternoon, First Minister. As ever, Brexit uncertainty remains the dominant theme for my committee. The Prime Minister has said he can get a Super Canada Plus free trade agreement with the EU by the end of 2020. Those of us who have studied this subject for some time, like my committee, know that that's well nigh impossible. However, Article 132 of the current withdrawal agreement does allow for the extension to the transition period to take place, but this has to be agreed by the 1st of July 2020, and any extension is going to be limited to 2 years maximum. So according to the withdrawal agreement itself, the new relationship between the EU and the UK needs to be agreed within 3 years. Do you have a view on the realism of this timetable?
First Minister.
I do, and I don't think it's realistic at all. I mean, if you take the next year, which I'll come back to the prospect of an extension in the moment, but it's probably as close to impossible as you can get to say that a trade deal between the UK and the EU, assuming that, you know, Boris Johnson, after this election, gets his deal through, that a trade deal could be agreed in that kind of time frame. There's no precedent for that. And I think given the complexities involved there and the experience of the withdrawal negotiations, I think anybody who thinks that is possible is not being straight with people. So I think we would find ourselves by the middle of next year in a situation where either an extension was being sought or not. And obviously, I can only go on public statements, but the statements of the current UK government, and I'm not saying all of their statements based on past experience should be given a lot of stock, but nevertheless, statements have been made that they would not seek an extension. So what we would find is that by the middle of next year, we were facing straight down the barrel of a no-deal Brexit again. And I think that is a very real prospect, and it's one that fills me with horror, given the amount of time and effort and money that the Scottish Government has had to expend on planning for no-deal exits, both in the run-up to March this year and again in the run-up to the end of October. Or we go into an extension and the wrangling and the negotiations just continue. And even 3 years, I mean, if you look at trade negotiations between the EU and other countries, other big trade agreements, the idea even in 3 years that is an achievable aim, I think, really beggars belief. So, you know, I do think that path, the one that the current UK government wants us to go down, is fraught with risk, fraught with danger, and just guarantees either a no-deal Brexit or years of more wrangling that we've experienced in the last 3.
Joan McAlpine.
Thank you very much for that answer, and which makes it clear that a no-deal Brexit is still a distinct possibility, which will concern many people. In October, the UK government published a revised no-deal tariff schedule. I know that I've received a wide range of representations, as I'm sure other conveners have here, regarding the implications of that tariff schedule for key sectors of the Scottish economy, and in particular for my area of the south of Scotland, the agricultural sector. Has the Scottish Government undertaken any assessment of the implications of that revised tariff regime for Scottish exports, and in particular for exports from the agricultural sector, and of course the implications for the agricultural sector of dropping tariffs on incoming produce?
First Minister.
Well, the Scottish Government, as you would expect, has looked carefully at the detail of this, and we have articulated publicly very real concerns about the impact, not just on the agricultural sector, but I think it's fair to say the agricultural sector is particularly likely to be affected. I mean, if you look at some of the particular sectors, you could see, if we were leaving with a no deal, in a no-deal situation, you would have, for beef, tariffs as high as 65%. Sheep meat exports, who would face most favoured nation tariffs, that would be 46%. The impact, I think, particularly on the sheep sector, would be devastating. Now, you talked about export and import tariffs. One of the arguments we made, which is the same argument that NFU Scotland, for example, made, was that the UK government should use the temporary tariff regime if we got into this situation, which would avoid compounding the impact of EU tariffs on Scottish exports if simultaneously to that we were to allow cheaper imports, and this temporary tariff would have avoided that. The UK government wasn't open, or hasn't so far been open to that argument, which I think is regrettable. So these are very real impacts, and while the immediate prospect of a no-deal exit has receded, I really do think we have to be very clear that it hasn't moved very further down the track. We will be back in this situation. Obviously, we're talking speculatively here because none of us know what the outcome of the election will be and what that means in terms of UK government. But assuming the current UK government's track is the one we still are on, that prospect of no deal with all these kind of implications is right back there very quickly.
Thank you very much.
Claire Adamson, Education and Skills, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, First Minister. Carrying on the theme of Brexit, the Education and Skills Committee took evidence earlier this year on the impact of Brexit on further and higher education. We have pursued some answers from the UK Government, writing to Priti Patel regarding the 3-year European Temporary Leave to Remain scheme. We've yet to have an answer, and we also had a video session cancelled with Chris Skidmore over the last few weeks. So given the concern in the higher and further education sectors, what has the Scottish Government done to try and get some clarity around these issues?
First Minister.
Well, we've been trying very hard with, I think if I can be diplomatic, varying degrees of success to get clarity about the preparations for Brexit in all of its different forms, but particularly some of the post-Brexit arrangements that would be in place. Further and higher education is by far not by far the only sector affected here, but the effects and the impacts would be particularly severe. I mean, if you look at colleges, I think more than £200 million of direct EU funding has benefited colleges since 2000 through structural funds and social funds. Scotland has had €650 million of research and innovation funding from Horizon 2020. We actually punch above our weight there. Universities punch above their weight because they get about 75% of that, and Scotland, universities get about 11% of the UK share, so we do very well. There's no clarity yet on what would replace those funding streams. We disproportionately benefit from the Erasmus schemes, with more Scottish students going to other EU countries and more EU students coming to Scotland. Again, we don't know what will replace that. You've mentioned the 3-year temporary leave to remain, which, given Scotland's 4-year degree, is obviously a concern that it simply doesn't meet our needs. And then you've got the situation with academic and research staff, where universities right now are feeling the impacts of Brexit in terms of it losing or making it more difficult to attract. So, there are many, many impacts there that have been very frustrating and will continue to be very frustrating as long as this situation continues.
Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. We received written submission from the Royal Society of Edinburgh touching on many of the issues that you've just mentioned, First Minister, particularly around the EU-funded research programmes. But some of the softer part of that is actually about the culture and the nature of our universities going forward, and how important that international collaboration is. And they're concerned about the fact we have 16% of EU students coming here, what impact that might have in the long term should there be further barriers put in place. We had an example of a low uptake of university lecturers and professors actually applying for EU settled status. In one case, a university was actively going around with an Android phone, and it's, you know, despite the embarrassment, the UK government can't even say there's an app for that. How much do you think this potentially could damage the future culture of our universities and colleges?
First Minister.
I mean, that's a big and really important question, and I think the impacts and the consequences of that will be felt in many different ways for a long period of time. I mean, I visited Glasgow University earlier this year to look in particular at the work they were doing to support EU nationals working, and they were also talking about the practical difficulties of not everybody being able to access Android phones. So they were doing some of that basic support work as well. Our universities, they're part of the sort of Scottish brand. They help project the country overseas, and I think anything that risks making our country seem less welcoming and less open is really, really damaging, and I think we've got to, you know, fight against that very, very hard. Most academics and researchers in our higher education system will tell you that funding for research is really important, but as important are the collaborations that the European programmes have facilitated and made more possible, and losing that is as damaging as losing the funding. You've then got some of the wider ripple effects. I mean, I remember looking at, I don't have the figures from this research to hand, but I can provide it if you're interested, looking at the economic benefit of Erasmus students who come from European countries to Scottish universities. We think about that and the impact on universities, but everything else they do while they're here has a wider economic benefit, and you multiply that up to all EU students, then you see that the ripples of this go literally into every aspect of our society. The thing that worries me most, and I worry a lot about so many aspects of Brexit, but overarching all of this, the thing that worries me most, and I think UK governments should be very worried about this as well, is what it does to the reputation, the international European reputation of the country. We desperately need to continue to be seen as an open, welcoming place for people to come and make a contribution, and if we're damaging that, then we risk our economic prosperity for a long time to come.
Bruce Crawford, Finance and Constitution.
Thank you very much. First Minister, as you know, the UK Government's decided that the UK budget will not now be published until early 2020 as a result of the general election. First Minister, I'm the first to recognise it's a very challenging situation for the Scottish Government, for local government, public bodies, and they'll need to respond very quickly in the setting of their income tax and spending plans in 2021. When they eventually know their settlement. And in that light, First Minister, and hot off the press, the Finance and Constitution Committee this morning considered the challenges and risks of publishing the Scottish budget before the UK budget, and we agreed to write to the Cabinet Secretary setting out our view that the Scottish budget is published after the UK budget, but recognising that in some circumstances it might still emerge that after the UK election will mean that will not be possible. We've asked our clerks to work with the Scottish Government officials to bring forward proposals for a bespoke process for the scrutiny of the 2021 budget, depending on the timing of the UK budget. But I'd be interested to know, First Minister, how is the Scottish Government preparing for this challenge, and how in particular are Scottish Government supporting local government and other public bodies to plan effectively as they can in the circumstances we face for next financial year?
First Minister.
Well, not to put too fine a point on it, this is really, really difficult, and you know, I'm probably not going to be able to convey the degree of intense frustration we feel, because you know, not being able to get on with the work of setting a budget has implications not just for government spending in the public services we directly fund, for the economy, but as you say, for health boards and for local authorities. And you know, you said that the budget, UK budget, had been postponed because of the UK election. Actually, if memory serves me correctly, they postponed the budget before the UK election was confirmed, as in a fit of pique, because the House of Commons had voted in a particular way over the Brexit deal. So we've got a government here that seems to be, or was seemingly just willfully refusing to undertake its core responsibilities as a government. So it puts us in the position where we don't know what a UK government's tax announcements are going to be. We don't know what the OBR's tax, social security and economic forecasts will be. Without that information, just to be blunt about it, we don't know how much money there's going to be in the Scottish budget next year. So we just have an inability to have a meaningful budget process. We are getting on with doing the preparation, at looking at our budget, making assumptions about what might be the case and trying to plan as much as possible. But we are doing that completely in the dark at the moment because we don't know what all of this information would do to the picture and the assumptions that we are making. So it is a horrendous situation to be put into, and it's not just the Scottish Government, the Welsh Government are in the same position. And actually, what makes it even worse, if the budget had been postponed but we had an alternative date, that would be one thing. We have no idea when a new UK government is likely to do a budget. So we don't know how long it will take to form a government after the election. We don't know then how long a new government will decide it needs before it puts a budget forward. Meanwhile, the clock is ticking. So I can't give you the definitive answers to what exactly we will do in all of the scenarios that unfold. We'll keep local authorities, health boards, other agencies as up to date as we possibly can, and we'll continue to liaise closely with your committee to try to make sure that we've got a process that allows for appropriate scrutiny in this Parliament, but recognises the quite unprecedented, because I think certainly in my experience of this place, unprecedented circumstances we find ourselves in.
Bruce Crawford.
Thank you. First Minister, you said yourself you simply can't know how much money is available to spend in 2021. Of course, there also remains the interaction of taxes between those that are set by the UK Government and taxes set by the Scottish Government, which cause significant difficulties for Scottish tax policy if the UK Government has not set its tax policy first. And therefore, in order to make sure that the Scottish budget takes place in an orderly fashion, we need that information as soon as possible. In that light, what contact has there been with the Treasury to ensure that the seriousness of the situation is fully grasped? And what's the response been?
First Minister.
The Finance Secretary has written to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, firstly making clear our very strong concerns, which I would expect are reflected across the Parliament, and also expressing the need for an early decision after the election about the timing of the UK budget. We've not been given any certain, if I can be briefly fair to the current incumbents, I guess it's impossible to give certainty about the timing of a budget after the election because nobody knows what the outcome of the election would be. So we will continue to try to get clarity as quickly as possible. But I think our Parliament has to prepare itself for this continuing to be an uncertainty with implications for our ability to set a budget well into the new year. And, the clock is ticking to the start of the new financial year. So we will need to work collaboratively across Parliament. We'll need to work particularly with your committee to try to fashion the best process we can out of whatever circumstances unfold.
Thank you. Margaret Mitchell, Justice Committee, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good afternoon, First Minister. The current prison population is only 220 prisoners short of the operating emergency capacity limit. Scotland's largest prison, the HMP Berlin, is 40% over capacity with over 1,400 prisoners, and the Auditor General reports that the Scottish Prison Service is facing threats to its financial sustainability. Will the First Minister acknowledge that this situation is untenable, and given that the current use of remand instead of alternative community-based disposals is a significant factor in the high prison population and the loss of third sector bail supervision programmes has increased the numbers on remand, what measures does the First Minister and her government intend to take to address this well-documented and vexing remand issue, and when will these measures be implemented?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, I am very concerned about the size of our prison population, not just in terms of the capacity issues, which are of serious concern, but also when you have, as we do, we used to say we had the second highest proportionately prison population in Western Europe. We now have the highest because we've overtaken England now. I don't believe that is a healthy situation, nor do I believe it reflects a situation where we are always dealing with those who've broken the law in the most effective manner that most aids rehabilitation. So we're taking, I should say, the issue of the prison population is under weekly scrutiny by the Cabinet at the moment, so we take it very seriously. There's a range of long-term reforms that we have been and continue to pursue. Obviously, sentencing is down to independent judges, so we cannot always influence, nor should we be able to influence the individual sentencing decisions that judges make and the decisions that judges will make on remand. We are investing in criminal justice social work. We're investing in more rehabilitative community sentences. We've increased the presumption against short sentences. We are taking a range of approaches that are about trying to reduce the prison population but actually have a more effective criminal justice system. And we're also opposing, and I'm not trying to be party political here, but I think your own party in this chamber is putting forward a lot of sentencing proposals that would go in the opposite direction. I think would increase the prison population by about 40%. So we're imposing what I would describe as wrong-headed proposals that are actually running counter to what we need to do, both in terms of ensuring we've got prisons that keep those within the care of the prison service safe with access to proper education and rehabilitation services, but that we're also having an approach to criminal justice that does the most to cut reoffending and promote rehabilitation. My final point would be we've invested heavily in the prison estate. We have invested, I think, almost £600 million since we took office in 2007. There's 3 new prisons, Lowmoss, Adderwell and Grampian. Obviously, a replacement for Barlinnie is one of our infrastructure priorities, and there's negotiations underway right now for a site for that. So we invest heavily, but for all sorts of reasons, reducing the prison population and having more effective sentencing is what we've got to stay focused on.
Margaret Mitchell.
I thank the First Minister for that response. The question was specifically on remand, and more could be done. I don't think it's just a matter of you can't affect what judges say. But I'll move on to another topic. It's preventative spend. The Robertson Trust has highlighted there is a budget tension between addressing immediate need and moving towards more preventative approaches. The SPS has, for understandable reasons, made an operational decision to focus its budget on immediate need rather than prevention, and consequently, since this summer, the SPS run Through Care scheme, which helped people keep out of prison after release, had to be closed because of short-term SPS operational need. Does the First Minister accept the closure? This closure is a worrying development likely to increase recidivism? And does she agree with Apex Scotland that the annual budget process for third sector organisations is extremely wasteful and inefficient and needs to be replaced as a priority with more sustainable and effective 3-year funding that would encourage preventative spend?
First Minister.
Well, a few points in there just briefly before I come on to this central point about programmes in prisons. There's always a tension between preventative spend and spending on current priorities. We see it in the NHS, we see it in the justice system. I believe we have to stick with trying to shift as much spend into prevention as possible. That is not always easy. We don't always live up to what we're trying to do there because of the tensions and because of the difficulties. My second point about 3-year funding, yes, I think there is a very strong case for 3-year funding for third sector organisations. We in the Scottish Government obviously deal with annual UK government budgets, which we need to determine our budgets on a 1-year basis, and as we've just been talking about, we don't even have a 1-year budget this year. So we are struggling right now because of the position we've been put in by the UK Government to give 1-year certainty to public services and third sector organisations, let alone 3-year certainty. So I think we can't have these discussions, in a vacuum and ignore the kind of wider context. And that is true also. So yes, I think it's a worry about programmes around rehabilitation not being able to be taken forward because of the pressures in our prison population. But for me, that means we've got to stick with the reforms of criminal justice so that we're seeing fewer people who actually would be better punished in the community going to prison. And again, I'm not trying particularly to be party political here, but I'm being asked questions here by the representative of a committee here today, I grant you, but more broadly by the representative of a party whose policies go in the opposite direction, who week after week I get challenged by...
Minister, I have to correct you. That's not unfair to Ms Mitchell. She is speaking for her committee and not as a Conservative member. So I can't
I'm
allow
simply
that.
making the point, and I'm not directing it.
There was no party political points.
No,
I'm
Ms Mitchell, I don't
the
need you
concerns
to...
of my committee.
Ms Mitchell, I don't need you to defend
Convener.
yourself. I'll do that because I do think that was not appropriate.
Convener, I'm simply making the point that we don't have these discussions in a vacuum, that the debates, the wider debates we have in Parliament are relevant in terms of the direction of policy travel here, and that's the point that I think is a legitimate point to make.
Thank you. Gordon Lyndhurst, Economy, Jobs and Fair Work Committee. Mr Lyndhurst.
Good afternoon, First Minister. The Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee looked at business funding as part of our budget scrutiny. Now, the Scottish Growth Scheme, which was launched in June 2017, which the First Minister will be familiar with, was launched as a 3-year programme with a target of £500 million. However, by the end of August of this year, so more than 2 years into the 3-year scheme, only just under £40 million of public sector investment had been made under that scheme. So my question is, how is the target of £500 million going to be achieved? And is the scheme going to simply run its natural course to the end of the 3 years, or will it be extended?
First Minister.
Obviously, the scheme right now is a 3-year scheme, and we will run it on that 3-year basis, as we would do with all schemes. We'll take decisions at an appropriate time about whether we want to extend it, whether we want to put further funding into it. I can give up to date, and it's important in contextual terms to make the point that the £500 million is not and was never intended to be all public money. It's public money that will also lever private investment. So the up-to-date figures for the growth scheme, and these are as of 30th of September, £160 million has been invested into 262 companies, and that includes private resources of £115 million that have been leveraged by the public sector investment. So that's the up-to-date position. Obviously, the business environment and the investment environment has been inevitably affected by the Brexit uncertainty, but nevertheless, this is an important scheme that is delivering investment into companies, and we'll continue to support it and progress it.
Gordon Lyndhurst.
Well, thank you, First Minister, for the updated figures, which are helpful, although they're still a small proportion of the 500 million originally set as the target. And against that backdrop, with the Scottish National Investment Bank now being brought before Parliament, how will the Scottish Government seek to ensure that that is more of a success in achieving its goals than the Scottish Growth Scheme appears to have been at this stage?
First Minister.
Well, we'll agree to differ on whether or not the growth scheme is a success or not. I think the figures I've just set out suggest a lot of companies are being helped with investment as a result of this scheme. Obviously, the Investment Bank will operate independently of ministers. Your committee has been scrutinising the bill and made some very constructive and helpful recommendations that we'll take forward in stage 2 amendments. But we have plans over the first decade for £2 billion of investment there, and it will be for those that we charge with running the bank to make sure, A, that those investments are supporting the missions of the bank, because it's mission-led investment, and also the appropriate returns, not just financial returns, but the returns overall in terms of the missions and the social benefit are being delivered, and that the right projects, the right companies, the right projects to meet those missions are being supported.
You can come in again if you wish.
But are there any lessons that can be learnt from how the Scottish Growth Scheme has progressed over the past 2 and a bit years for the approach to the Scottish National Investment Bank?
Very possibly, and we will look to do that. So we'd be very happy to liaise more with your committee about how we can do that, what lessons we think there are. I suppose I would simply make the point is that the National Investment Bank is a very different animal, if you like, to the growth scheme, both in terms of structure and governance and scale and its mission-led activity. So while, of course, we should look to see whether there are lessons that we can translate from that into the bank, I think we have to to make sure we get the setup and the governance of the bank right, which is why the progress of the bill is important, get the missions right, and make sure that it succeeds on its own terms, and not just the scrutiny of the bill, but as the bank continues, that's going to be important. But if there's a more sort of structured exercise we can do between government and the committee to look at any read across from the growth scheme to the bank, we'd be happy to consider that.
Joanne Lamont, Public Petitions.
Okay, thank you very much. Public Petitions Committee, as ever, has a wide range of issues that it's looking at, and you can reflect on the agenda of a Public Petitions Committee. You will see things that are maybe ignored by a public debate, or indeed things that are actually very much part of public debate, and quite often the persistence and length of a petition with us reflects a concern. So I want to ask about one particular one, both specifically about the immediate issues around this petition, but also how government addresses some of the challenges in relation to this. So the two petitions I want to highlight to you relate to the A75 and the A77. And during our scrutiny of these petitions, we've repeatedly heard significant concerns about the safety and quality of the roads, the impact on the environment, and also the impact of the current road infrastructure on the long-term economic future of the southwest of Scotland. So, I mean, I know there's a strategic transport project review, but I wonder to what extent you have been able to reflect on and act on the concerns of people about these particular roads, and I maybe ask you to say something more about the broader economic issue after that.
First Minister.
I mean, first thing, I hope you appreciate this. It's not possible for me to come here with detail of every single petition before your committee, so some of my answer inevitably will be in general terms, although I know the importance of the issues raised around the A75 and the A77, and I'll come back to that in a second. But I think the process of petitions is very important. Firstly, it's obviously a way for the public into the workings of this Parliament, but it's also very important for government. We look very carefully at individual petitions, and obviously we respond and try to respond and learn from petitions as they go through the process. But we also look at the pattern of petitions and the numbers coming in on different issues, whether there are particular issues that keep coming back or stay before your committee for a long time. So we do try to take cognizance of that. There will always be things that, you know, government can never quite do exactly what a petitioner is wanting, but nevertheless we try to take account of the general thrust and the general points that are being made. On the roads in particular and transport, obviously we are looking, we have a transport strategy, we're looking at the overall strategy. There's a big priority now, and I'm not talking about these roads in particular, I'm talking generally to trying to get traffic off roads and onto public transport for the climate imperative, but for the rural parts of our country, whether the parts served by these roads or further north with some of the roads there, it's really important that we listen to the views of individuals and communities and commuters, because the economic impact as well as safety and environmental impacts of good connections, and the south of Scotland I think has often a particularly strong case to make here. The economic impact of good connections is vital. So that's not addressing the precise detail of these petitions because I don't have them in front of me, but the general point I want to make is we look carefully at all petitions that are put forward.
Joanne Lamont.
I might ask you to consider one small thing then. Round the general process of petitions, it would be immensely helpful where the government does have a view when they look at the petition, if that could be shared with the petition committee before we even look at it, because it speeds up the process. I can write to you about it separately, but I think it would be really useful if we could speed up that process where you know what your position is and you can at least give us a first stab at it. I think would be really helpful. Well, I appreciate that can't necessarily be done in all cases. But can I come back to this question? I don't expect you to know all the details. That's the job of your Transport Minister, to know what the detail of the building infrastructure is. But what is your job is to understand the broader context. And what is being said currently is that the problem with these roads in the state that they're in is actually meaning that some companies will actively choose to stop travelling from Ireland through the southwest of Scotland and change the journeys, and a concern at a local level. Not only they've got the environmental impact of roads, they've got lorries coming through and so on, but on the other hand, you've got economic activity being inhibited because of that problem and that issue there. So can I ask, what is your process for dealing with that kind of issue? So it's not just the Transport Secretary, but has the person responsible for economics within the Cabinet looking at that,
Yes.
Environmental Minister as well? Is there a process for cross-cutting in this kind of petition?
First Minister.
So yes, all relevant interests. We try as far as possible, and we're not perfect at this, but I think partly because of our relative smallness as a country, we are better than many at not seeing things in individual silos. So there will always be, in responding to a petition, a lead department and a lead set of officials under a particular minister that has key responsibility for that, but all relevant interests will feed into that. So in the kind of petition you're talking about here today, absolutely, the economic perspective, the environmental perspective, often road safety, which brings justice in, all of that will have a bearing on our response to any petition or any issue that's raised. We have across, not just with issues that are raised in petitions, but we have a process of prioritising how we spend the budget we've got, how we take forward particular issues. But the kind of issues you're talking about there today will always be key in terms of these kind of decisions that we make. On your point request, I'm happy to consider any proposals from the committee about how we further aid the consideration of petitions. I suppose one note of caution is sometimes when we are responding to a petition, even although we have a fixed position or have had a fixed position, we don't want to close our minds to what might be coming forward in the petition. So I think there's a balance to be struck between being definitive but also being open to the evidence that the petition brings forward.
No, I absolutely agree with that, but can I just repeat on the issue of the roads? It's not in response to the petition that I'm asking you to think about the issue the petition is reflecting, which is there is more in this problem than for the Transport Minister. So I suppose we would be looking for an indication, is there already a group of Cabinet Ministers working together on the question of this real challenge to the infrastructure and the economy of the south of Scotland?
Well, we've obviously had a cross-cutting government exercise that's led to the creation of the new South of Scotland enterprise. So all of these issues as part of the sort of economic development of the South of Scotland are dealt with on a cross-government basis. I was sort of answering in the context of petition because you're the committee of the Petitions Committee, but that approach that I described is the approach we take to the development of all policy and all aspects of decision making. We don't have, so any piece of government policy or any case that's been put forward to support a particular decision is informed by the different policy interests. It's not simply the Transport Minister that is important in terms of investment in roads. The economic needs of an area, the economic limitations of roads that require investment, if there are, and this obviously was an issue in terms of the earlier consideration around dualling the A9, the safety of the road, all of these issues will come together to inform decision making. And often it won't be the immediate policy interest that will be the key one or the overriding one. It will be something that is a knock-on effect, in this case, the economic limitations that you're describing. We can, if I'm not describing the kind of cross-cutting, and obviously the other point to make, which is not peculiar to the point you're raising here, but it is deliberately designed to aid that cross-government, cross-cutting approach, is the National Performance Framework that sits across everything we do. If I'm not articulating it as well as I could do, I'm more than happy to try and set it out for your committee in more detail so that you've got a full understanding of how we would go about not just answering petitions, but addressing these issues overall.
That's very helpful, and it would be useful to give us an indication of how you analyse the effectiveness of that cross-cutting work, because the point of this petition is they're saying nothing is really changing and they're very concerned. I wonder, you could maybe, rather than having to answer it now, simply include that how you actually monitor the effectiveness of your own work in that area.
Would it help, as an exercise that we can take away and do, using these petitions as a kind of case study to maybe describe the process that government goes through and how we reach decisions?
I think that's called a result. Lewis MacDonald, you have a supplementary.
Thank you. Again, I don't expect you to be familiar with the detail of the current consultation on dualling the A96 in Aberdeenshire, but on the same theme, would you expect, in considering that the least expensive or the least...
We hold your horses. You are convener of health and sport. I don't know what duelling that's got to do with health and sport. If you can make a connection in the next 30 seconds, you're a better man than I am. Let's hear it. You haven't made it. We're moving on.
I would certainly see it as relevant, but I take your guidance, convener.
You're blooming right, you do,
surprised.
Mr. MacDonald. A good try, but failed. And now move on. And now move on to Bob Doris, please. Social Security.
Sticking strictly to social security, Deputy Presiding Officer, First Minister, the Social Security Committee will have a keen interest in the recently published Scottish Government benefits uptake strategy, given that we are conducting an inquiry into benefits uptake ourselves. And I would note, for instance, the Best Start pregnancy and baby payments saw 7,000 payments by January 2019, as opposed to the estimated 4,000. With the very welcome Scottish Child payment commencing in next year's budget, and the Scottish Government rightly committed to maximising uptake, is the First Minister confident there will actually be enough adequate budgets to meet that demand?
First Minister.
Well, these are demand-led budgets, so yes, we will. Our responsibility is to make sure the budget is there, and we take the decisions to support whatever the demand is. And I don't underestimate the pressure that this puts on Scottish Government budgets, but we have set a very clear objective in all of the social security benefits that we've taken responsibility for, or will have responsibility for, to make sure that we are focusing on increasing uptake as much as possible. That's why the benefit take-up strategy is so important. The Scottish Fiscal Commission will provide for us benefit expenditure forecasts, which will be a key part of our budget process. I think their most recent set of forecasts, which are from May this year, estimated that demand-led social security would be in the region of £3.5 billion. That, of course, excludes the new Scottish Child payment, and their more up-to-date forecast will be published alongside the budget whenever we get to the point where we're putting forward a budget.
Okay,
Bob Doris.
That's helpful, First Minister, but I would note, I think the Scottish Fiscal Commission based appropriate budget lines based on estimated benefit take-up, and that's not done at 100%, so there would be budget implications if demand was to significantly increase. But I thanks for those reassurances. First Minister, our committee is also concerned that the Scottish Government wish to take measures to increase the uptake of reserve benefits, known as policy spillover, within the fiscal framework. The UK Government may expect the Scottish Government to pick up that bill. Will the Scottish Government look urgently at this matter to ensure there will be no financial loss to Scotland if we wish, for example, to drive a benefit uptake in reserve benefits in Scotland?
First Minister.
Well, I think this is a concern, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that's been raised in the past over how the fiscal framework operates, and it's fair to say in the years that the fiscal framework has been operating, we, and I'm sure the same is true of the UK Government, have got more experience of how it operates well, and also where it might need improving, and obviously it's coming up for review, and this is one area where we will want to be absolutely certain that there wasn't that knock-on spillover effect to the Scottish Government if we are encouraging greater uptake of reserve benefits. I don't think anybody across the Parliament would want to see that happen, because I would hope everybody would take the view that we should be encouraging people who are eligible for any benefit, whether they're devolved benefits or reserve benefits, to take up that entitlement, and the cost for that should fall on the government that is responsible for those benefits.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, thanks, Presiding Officer. Of course, First Minister, the committee will have to take a view in relation to what an appropriate benefits uptake strategy should look like. And I note again that the Scottish Government strategy is restricted to devolved benefits, is my understanding. And my committee is particularly interested in greater automation and passporting of benefits more generally to increase uptake levels. If I give you a couple of examples, First Minister, in Glasgow, there's the automation of the school clothing grant, and I understand recently the Best Start grant also. Has the Scottish Government given consideration to how such good practices can be shared right across Scotland to maximise such benefits uptake levels?
Well, you're right that there are some good practice examples already, the one you talk about in Glasgow, so we would encourage local authorities to look at that. More generally, we want to, over the longer term, build more automation into the Scottish social security system. I think there is a great argument, not identical but similar to the one we were talking about earlier in health, to make it easier for people to access these benefits. At the moment, of course, our principal focus is on delivering, making the transition and delivering these devolved benefits safely and securely. But over the longer term, we are very keen to look at how we streamline those systems and make them as easy for people to use as possible.
Okay, thank you.
Bruce Crawford did, and it is on this particular issue.
It's on
isn't
particular
it?
spillover. I'm sure if I'm straying, you'll tell me.
Oh, definitely.
Well, policy spillovers are happening in other areas as well, and obviously it's something the Finance and Constitution Committee take a particular interest in. And there is a policy spillover, which I understand there is no agreement yet between the Scottish Government and the UK Government in regard to the personal allowance changes made in the last budget by the UK Government. Where's that dispute got to?
It hasn't been resolved yet, like many of the disputes. I can get you get your committee more detail on exactly what the latest is in the exchanges around that. But these are the kind of issues that crop up. Sometimes they're resolved, more often they're not resolved. But I think all of these issues are increasingly feeding into the review of the fiscal framework, which is looming large, and having undergone the agreement of the first fiscal framework, I wouldn't be telling the truth if I said I was looking forward to the review process, but I think it's really, really important that we get it right, because we do now know where some of the pitfalls are, and we've got to be more mindful of them in future.
Thank you. James Dorn and Local Government and Communities.
Good afternoon, First Minister. Section 2(3)(a) of the Domestic Abuse Scotland Act 2018 talks of, quotes, behaviour which makes the victim dependent on or subordinate to the perpetrator, for example, preventing access to money. This, of course, can, in many, if not most cases, be more damaging after the woman has gathered up the courage to leave her abuser. Recently, I chaired a roundtable with victims and supporting organisations where this message about financial coercion came across loud and clear. Could the First Minister tell me what provisions she sees in the Act to protect these women from this ongoing, sometimes ongoing for decades, abuse?
Minister.
Well, the whole thrust of this Act, of course, is to make it more possible to address and treat as a criminal offence the kind of behaviour you're talking about. So, as you know, the whole objective of the Act is to allow to be addressed courses of behaviour that are designed to make someone's partner or indeed ex-partner dependent on them or subordinate on them, depriving them of freedom or restricting their ability to communicate with friends and family, monitoring their activities on a day-to-day basis, and certainly the kind of behaviour you talk about, which is controlling or restricting access to money, is a key part of what controlling behaviour would be. So the whole thrust of this Act is about trying to ensure that the law can address that kind of behaviour, which the law previously often struggled to address. It's early days in the operation of the Act. The latest figures have been already 13 convictions under the new law. There's a number of proceeding through the courts at the moment. So it's going to take a fair bit of time to fully understand the effects of the law, but the kind of behaviour you talk about is exactly the kind of behaviour that is intended to be captured by it.
And I thank you for that response. But the main area of concern from everyone at the meeting was the need for institutions, from the civil courts to the police, from the prison service to local authorities, from housing to the financial institutions, to recognise these controlling and abusive factors often present when dealing with such cases. First Minister, your commitment to protect the vulnerable, particularly women, is a clear matter of record. Can I therefore ask that your government will commit to work with myself, the victims and the supporting organisations to put in place appropriate measures to help change attitudes towards financial abuse and coercion, just as been done over the years, to take the horrors of the physical abuse from being a domestic issue behind closed doors to being recognised for what it always was, and that's a serious criminal offence. Only once we've done that can we recognise, and this is recognised as a damaging offence, and measures are put in place, can we truly say we've done all we can to support these women.
Can I just clarify, so you said to work with myself, but you mean, your committee?
No, I'm just clarifying. Yes.
Thank you, yes. Not just you personally, not a little meeting, no. Right. First Minister.
Well, I think it's a really serious point, because the new law is important because it rectifies a clear deficiency in the law. But there's a much deeper and more fundamental job that we've got to do here. And you know, I don't particularly like the term culture change, but that is exactly what we're talking about here, because we still have a situation where the kinds of behaviour that are now rightly criminalised by this new Act are not always recognised by the victims, perhaps even the perpetrators, but I'm less worried about that, and certainly by the courts and the system as the criminal offences that they are. So we had a public awareness campaign that accompanied the lead up to and the introduction of the Act to try to begin this process, and there's a lot of work there still to do. So I'd be very happy to work with you and your committee to take this forward over the next period. Obviously, this whole agenda is far from complete here. We've announced plans for protective orders to further protect victims of domestic abuse, specifically around the issue about financial control. It's one of the reasons why it's so important, if you take universal credit, for example, that we don't just have the single household payment and that we have split payments. So there's a whole load of work here that we have to continue to do, but there's no doubt in my mind that this Act makes a big difference and in itself will help with that culture change that we're trying to effect.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Edward Mountain, Rural Economy and Connectivity.
Thank you. Good afternoon, First Minister. Could I just remind you that in my register of interest, I'm down as with farming and fishing interests. The committee is looking forward to the Good Food Nation bill that's going to come for us, I think, in the next year. Could you give the committee some guarantees that procurement of good Scottish food for our schools, hospitals and prisons will be within that bill?
I'm not going to, obviously, we're in the process of deciding on the exact content of the bill, and we consulted on the broad proposals for the bill. We're currently analysing that, so we'll bring a bill forward over the course of the period we've said we will. So I'm not going to go into giving commitments about particular provisions, but the procurement of good, healthy food for schools, hospitals and other parts of the public service, I think it's fair to say is an important priority for us, not just in terms of the health benefits of that, but food and drink is one of the most successful parts of our economy, and we need to make sure that we are doing everything we can to boost the ability of our food producers to sell into Scotland as well as export their lovely food overseas.
Thank you. First Minister, one of the bills that was announced in 2016 as part of the programme for government was the Inshore Fisheries Bill, which has disappeared. It's caused a certain amount of disappointment amongst fishers, environmentalists and communities, preventing new entrants probably entering and stopping illegal dredging. Is there any way the government will be able to look at those issues, although they're not looking at an inshore fisheries bill?
First Minister.
We did commit to introducing new legislation for inshore fisheries management, and we did preparatory work on that bill in 2016, but something then happened in the middle of 2016, Brexit, which created a lot of uncertainty around future fisheries management, which made it very difficult to continue down that legislative track. There's no doubt that our ability to take these decisions in terms of future legislation has been heavily impacted on that, and of course the previous UK government didn't complete its UK fisheries bill during the last Parliament, and we don't know when that bill will be laid in future. We've discussed the approach that we're taking to ensure fisheries management with key stakeholders. I stand to be corrected, and no doubt this will not be a universal position, but broadly speaking, our feeling is there is an understanding of the position that the government has taken. While we're not at this stage proceeding with the legislation for the reasons I've just set out, we have, however, taken and will continue to take action to improve management of inshore fisheries, action that doesn't rely solely on legislation. So, for example, we've invested £1.5 million through the programme for government to modernising of the inshore fleet, inshore fisheries pilots, which are developed through the Regional Inshore Fisheries Group Network and are designed to take forward a more localised approach to fisheries management. We're progressing with those as well, and trialling greater use of spatial management to benefit the whole of the country. So while we're not doing the legislation in the timescale we originally considered we would do it, we are taking forward and will continue to take forward other action.
Thank you, First Minister. And the last question is, we recently heard at the committee about the announcement of the preferred bidder for the southern and central contracts for broadband, the R100 rollout. We were told that the northern contract preferred bidder won't be announced till nearer to Christmas, on the basis that it is just preferred bidders at this stage and that work won't start as soon as the contracts are awarded. Are you still confident that you will achieve R100 by 2021, as you last stated when you were in the Parliament?
Well, we've now, as you've said, we have announced the preferred bidder for Central and South. We will confirm there was more than one bidder for the North lot. We'll confirm the preferred bidder of that soon, very soon, I hope, and it is still our intention to have contract signature in this calendar year. In terms of the precise delivery timescale, so we have the commitment we've made, we want to deliver on that commitment, but we will set out the precise delivery timescales when we have contract signature, because to do that before then, obviously, it would be the wrong way round, and I'm sure that will be subject to great scrutiny by your own committee and by Parliament. The final point I would make on this is the R100 programme is the biggest of its kind anywhere in the UK. It is obviously complex. We've got to get it right. It's a £600 million programme. I think 97% of that has been funded directly by the Scottish Government, despite arguably, or inarguably, some may say this being a reserved matter. So this is big. It will get next generation future-proofed broadband infrastructure to 100% of premises across the country, and we are absolutely committed to delivering it, and at speeds that are way in advance of anything else being proposed across the UK.
So still confident?
Look, I've set out the position here. I am absolutely committed to this programme. I think it is hugely important. We were talking about the importance of transport to the economic development, particularly of rural Scotland. There is no doubt at all that this programme and broadband infrastructure is just as vital in many respects. So I am absolutely committed to this programme. I think the £600 million investment is a sign of that. We have to get the contracts right. These are complex programmes, and we will continue to take that forward, and when we've got contract signature, which as I say we hope will be in this calendar year, we'll be able to set out the precise delivery timescales for Parliament to scrutinise properly.
Thank you.
Ruth Maguire, Equalities and Human Rights.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. First Minister, just a few months ago, Jackie Kay, the Scots Macker, said that Scotland had to grow up about racism. She commented that the history of slavery is not part of Scotland's national curriculum, so there is widespread ignorance across the country of its active role in slavery. Last month, CRER, the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights, wrote an open letter to our Parliament criticising the lack of focus on race over the past 20 years. They looked at chamber debates and the work of committees and have found that overall race is discussed much less now than it was in the early days of Parliament. For example, over the past 2 decades, there have been only 5 chamber debates on race alone, with an 11-year gap between a debate on race equality led by the Minister for Communities in June 2006 and one held in December 2017 led by the Cabinet Secretary for Communities, Social Security and Equalities. They rightly question why that is. Could it be the joining of the equality strands into the Equalities Act 2010, or the lack of BME representation in our Parliament, or is it because the Scottish Government is not undertaking work that can be scrutinised? 2 decades later, BME groups still experience significant inequalities and disparities in all areas of public life in Scotland, from employment to housing to education and justice. And nearly a quarter of people living in Scotland believe there is sometimes a good reason to be prejudiced against certain groups. They ask, and I'm asking you, First Minister, isn't this Scotland 20 years on entitled to strong leadership from politicians and an acknowledgement that racism exists in our institutions and structures?
First Minister.
Well, I would never seek to suggest that racism doesn't exist in Scotland in broader society as well as in different institutions. I believe it does, and I believe we all have an obligation, a very serious obligation, to both acknowledge that and to tackle it. There are many different issues that have kind of been thrown up by your question, which I'll try to run through as quickly as possible. The Scottish Government does a great deal of work around equality generally and different aspects of equality. I'd be happy to look at whether we could bring a particular debate to Parliament, although I do think this is more fundamental than that in many different respects. You talk about BME representation in Parliament, which is something that I think we have got, a mountain of work still to do around, and that's for all of our respective political parties to take seriously, and we've all got work to do on that. There are still a number of barriers to BME communities in terms of access to services, in terms of employment that need to be dealt with systematically. And then I suppose more generally, and it's something that I will not be alone in feeling a discomfort about. So I don't think at any point over the past 20 years could we ever have confidently said we've dealt with the issue of racism in Scotland. I think that complacency would always have been completely misplaced and wrong. And I should say, I think Jackie Kay was right to jolt everybody out of any kind of sense of complacency around this. But nevertheless, I think there is a sense in more recent times that progress that not just Scotland but maybe across the UK and further afield that we had sort of taken for granted we had made, and that things were going in the right direction, that all of us have had cause to question whether that is actually the case, and whether I definitely think there is a sense of renewed licence that some people feel to articulate racist attitudes and to voice racist slurs, and the general sort of, and I'm absolutely not pointing the finger at anybody or any political party, but the general tenor of our political debate, I think, risks taking us back the way here. So I don't think we should ever have been complacent over the past 20 years, but I absolutely think now is a time where we really have to look ourselves very hard in the mirror and decide that this is something we have to collectively give much more priority and leadership to.
Yeah.
Yes, no, that was a nod. Proceed. I was being too subtle. I'm not good at subtle.
Okay.
Yes.
First Minister, Clare have also written to my committee and asked us to scrutinise the Scottish Government's Race Equality Action Plan following the publication of a Year 1 progress update. And we'll be doing this in the next few weeks. As you know, the action plan covers a range of themes: employment, health, housing, participation and representation, and community cohesion. Can I ask what oversight you have of the action plan, and are you content or concerned with its current progress?
First Minister.
We monitor progress carefully. So in terms of the oversight within government, and the Race Equality Action Plan is, you know, but for the benefit of everybody else here, sets out the actions that we will take during the current parliamentary term. We appointed Caliani Lyle as our independent race equality advisor back in 2017 to provide both advice and challenge to help us advance race equality and tackle racism. So in some respects, the action plan responds directly to the recommendations that she has made. In the 2 years since it was published, I think some progress has been made, but there is still a lot to do. In terms of the oversight within government, there is a programme board that is chaired by the Director General for Education, Communities and Justice, with a strong governance structure in place. The next update report is due, I think, in March 2020, so very soon, which will set out the progress that has been made and what work is underway to take forward actions in the areas where we've still got work to do. And I think the scrutiny that you've talked about today that your committee will apply will be a useful part of that process.
Do you have another question?
I have another 2 questions.
Okay. Another 2? I don't know. We'll hear the next one anyway then.
First Minister, a further open letter on race and racism. It was signed by 80 signatories, which included activists, community workers, academics and educators, drew attention to the difference between colour-based racism and racism faced by white migrant groups. And it called for discussions on race to, and I'll quote them here if I may, recognise that whilst discrimination and xenophobia faced by white migrant groups must be tackled, for most of these groups this will reduce over generations. The perception of whiteness will eventually confer an advantage, and at the very least the advantage of freedom from the impact of skin colour based on stereotypes, prejudice and hatred. The letter asks that those with influence, including politicians, seek to understand race and racism beyond legal definitions in the Equality Act, which, as you'll know, protects people from discrimination on grounds of colour, nationality and ethnic or national origins. The open letter calls for evidence-based policy approaches to take account of the history of racialisation and the current experience of discrimination, which creates worse outcomes for people from specific ethnic backgrounds in specific areas of life. Can I ask what your response is to the signatories of this letter, and if you think it's fair criticism of the Scottish Government and indeed other institutions in Scotland. And just in case the Deputy Presiding Officer doesn't let me back in.
Excuse me. No, that's your question. And then I was just, if you'll bear with me, because we do have time, I was going to let you ask that, and I'm going to let other people in. I've got a supplementary from Bob, then we go on, Bob Doris, then we go on to open supplementaries, and you could come in then.
Okay.
So don't over-egg it.
Okay.
I'd be very happy to look personally at the letter that has the 80 signatories and take very seriously, if there hasn't been a response from the government yet, make sure that there is a detailed response to that. I think, so obviously I'd want to consider it before responding in detail to whether I thought criticisms, and because I don't know exactly what the criticisms are entirely fair. In general, though, I think it raises a really important issue that we do have to understand racism and discrimination in its historical context, but also in its current context, how different people and different groups experience discrimination. I've got a very strong interest in this from my own constituency experience. In my constituency in the south side of Glasgow, there is a very large, now well-established immigrant population from Pakistan and India, smaller African immigrant population, but also a more recent immigrant population from Eastern European countries. So there is already there obvious signs of the different experiences of discrimination, but also how in some cases that will erode over time, in others it will be less likely to. So I think we must both understand this in all of that multi-layered complexity, but also make sure that our responses to it reflect that. And I'm very keen to respond, to engage with the signatories of that letter to make sure that the action plans and the actions that we are taking forward are geared to reflect that complexity.
Thank you, First Minister.
Bob Doris, do you have a supplementary on that?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for raising that question, because it actually brings into some evidence we got at Social Security Committee in relation to benefits uptake. One of the challenges that academics have in research is actually estimating who's entitled to benefits in the first place, and then what the projected uptake would look like. Now, one of the surveys around that is called the Haggis survey, actually Health Ageing in Scotland survey for those who are 50 and above, and there are a variety of other household surveys as well. But what our committee is not clear about, and we'd like more information on, perhaps the government could get back to us, is what account is taken of age, of gender, of black minority ethnic groups, to make sure we capture that data properly, because getting the data in the first place is quite challenging, getting it accurate is even more challenging, and I'm just wondering whether it's been equality proof. That'd be really helpful for our committee to know.
I'm happy to provide
yeah, of course.
to hand, but I'll make sure it's provided. I think, though, the general issue here, whether you're talking about provision of services or provision of information or access to services, uptake of benefits, you cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach. I apologise for going back to my constituency experience again, but in parts of the constituency I represent, literally nothing can have that one. So whether you're giving people information about the days their bins are collected through to how to access the health services, you have to consider doing that in a multilingual way in different formats. So increasingly we live in a, thankfully, it's a good thing, an increasingly diverse society, and we must make sure in a sort of proactive way that people can access services on an equitable basis, but also that we are understanding the impacts of that on discrimination and prejudice and racism. So this is really important work, I think, if we are to give substance to the rhetoric that we want a one Scotland where people are respected and can access services and be treated with dignity regardless of their background.
Now, that concludes that sort of round, and I know I said, Gillian Martin, I cut you off short at the beginning. I didn't realise you wanted another question, so as long as it's still on your committee remits and what they're... Gillian Martin, I've got Gillian Martin, and then have we got anybody else who wants to come in? Following on, right, so I've got Gillian Martin, then I've got Margaret Mitchell. Who else? Joan McAlpine. And the indomitable Ruth Maguire, I think. She's got that other question that I didn't let her have. Gillian Martin, please.
Thank you, President. I'm really grateful for getting a second stab at this. The Climate Change Act's obviously passed, and now the government's having to produce very, very quickly an updated climate change plan by April next year. But we know that Scotland can't reach our targets unless the UK government meet theirs too. We've got more stretching targets than the UK government, but we have a situation where the UK Government's Environment Bill is effectively fallen as a result of general election and other things that are getting in the way. Could the First Minister give me an indication of what the effective falling of the action any action that might have been in the pipeline down in the UK to address climate change is actually having on the Scottish Government in terms of our ability to put our plans in place to address our targets?
First Minister.
I think this is probably less of an issue in the immediate term, but will become an increasing issue as we journey towards these target dates. There's no doubt that delays in environment bills because of the current Westminster political situation don't help us. In the immediate term, I would also point to the lack of certainty for renewable technology, particularly around onshore wind, and we desperately need to see onshore wind get routes to funding again. So these are short-term issues that we, for example, there's a proposal to triple VAT on home solar systems, for example. So all of these things don't help and, in fact, hinder our plans. Longer term, though, and again, you only have to read the report of the Committee on Climate Change to see this, that there are things that we will require the UK Government to do if we are to be able to meet our targets. And Rosanna Cunningham has been very open with Parliament in setting that out. I think the key things the Committee on Climate Change set out were around decarbonisation of the gas grid. We cannot do that unilaterally. Carbon capture and storage, where we need to see proper investment and proper priority given by the UK Government. I think the other area they specifically pointed to was the timetable for moving to electric and low emission vehicles, where there is a need for the UK Government to match the kind of timescale that the Scottish Government has committed to. So there is undoubtedly a very strong crossover here. And I would hope on this, particularly as we get into the lead up to COP next year in Glasgow, that we do see, party politics aside, because this should transcend party politics, that we see that genuinely coordinated and joined up approach. And it will be important for us to continue to encourage it. And I would hope that your committee would take a close interest in these linkages as well.
Thank you.
Margaret Mitchell.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. This is about third sector funding, criminal justice, third sector funding. Clearly, adequate funding for the third and voluntary sector is vital to support and ensure the success of community-based alternatives to prison. However, currently, the vast majority of third sector funding goes through local authorities who are competitors with the third sector and have a vested interest in retaining this funding in-house. This despite the third sector being better placed with the experience, expertise and flexibility to carry out this community justice work. Will the First Minister commit to address this blatant unfairness in the forthcoming budget?
First Minister.
We'll consider that point. Obviously, there is very often pushback to the government if we are seeking to redirect funding streams that go to local government to other areas, and people across the Parliament will take a very different view on that. So these can be not straightforward issues, but I'm very happy to have an open discussion if people want to put proposals forward for how we fund things differently. We've ring-fenced the £100 million funding in our budget for criminal justice social work services. I am, and again this is drawn largely from my experience as Health Secretary, I am an advocate of the fact that very often third sector organisations are better placed and are often more innovative in the solutions they put forward. We've, as a government, protected the direct funding we give to third sector organisations. I can't dictate how councils choose to use their budgets, and as I say, when we propose redirecting council budget lines, that can be controversial, but there's definitely a debate to be had there, and I'm very happy for the government to engage in it.
Joe McAlpine. Thanks
very much. First Minister, we talked earlier about the fact that a no-deal exit from the EU was definitely not off the table. And in October, the Scottish Government brought out a document on no-deal preparations. you were talking about repurposing the old port in Stranraer as a lorry park, for example, if there's more traffic from Northern Ireland. But you also mentioned in that document that that for the southwest of Scotland and the Stranraer area and Cairnryan area, there could be an increase in smuggling and even organised crime. And I wondered what preparations had been put in place for that eventuality, but also if the withdrawal agreement does go ahead with the Northern Ireland Protocol in place, what would be the implications for South West Scotland of that happening?
Well, it's on the edge of the south of Scotland, got a couple of mentions there, but it is to do with Brexit. And in fairness, the Northern Ireland and Scottish thing is relevant. So, yes.
Thank you.
At the end of that.
Obviously respect your ruling on these matters.
I was chewing it over.
On the issue, it is definitely a risk with the no deal scenario of increased crime and smuggling around Stranraer and the sort of points of access from Northern Ireland. I personally, the Justice Secretary as well, have had discussions with the police about that. I'm not going to go into detail about what the police would seek to do to try to mitigate that and deal with any risk there. That's operational matters for the Chief Constable and the police, but these are issues that have been under very close and regular discussion, and if this comes back as a prospect, will be again. And while we've effectively paused no-deal planning at the moment, you know, all of these plans are still there and will be reactivated very quickly should we consider at any stage that we're heading in that direction. The Northern Ireland Protocol, I mean, I should say I do not in any way grudge or oppose Northern Ireland having the arrangement it needs to protect peace and the Good Friday Agreement, but I have an absolutely acute concern about the competitive disadvantage Scotland would be at if we have Northern Ireland effectively still in the single market and the customs union. I know, you know, I spend a lot of my time as First Minister, you know, talking to potential inward investors. We are in a competitive marketplace for inward investment, and often Belfast will be competing with Glasgow or Edinburgh for big investment decisions. And if we find ourselves in a position where Belfast has special access to the European single market, then that will have a serious impact on our ability to attract investment. And I think, again, views of Brexit aside, party views aside, I think everybody who cares about the future of the Scottish economy and the health of the Scottish economy should be seriously worried about that.
And lastly, and I hope briefly, Ms Maguire.
Thank you. First Minister, I just wanted to finish by asking what your message is to BME members of our community here in Scotland that feel that progress on equality and removing those systematic barriers that we spoke about is painstakingly slow. And would you agree that the criticisms that we discussed earlier should shame us all into action?
First Minister.
I think as long as we have a situation where any part of our broader community in Scotland faces discrimination, prejudice, racism or systematic barriers to fulfilling their potential, then we should all take that as a personal responsibility. As First Minister, I recognise my very special responsibility to show leadership there. So my message is that they should see me and the Scottish Government as an ally in this, and that our door is open to ensuring that we have the right dialogue and conversations to do the things that we need to do. I think representation is not the only part of this, but I think it is a big part of this. That takes us more into the political sphere. But, you know, I would say, it's the third time I think I've mentioned my constituency experience. I think there might be some challenge on this. I think I represent the most diverse constituency in the whole of the country. So I see many of these issues up close on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. And I hope that gives me a deeper understanding, but it also makes me more determined that we address these issues, no matter how difficult they are, no matter how complex. We have to give meaning to what I think all of us want to see in Scotland, which is a country where people are valued for who they are, regardless of where they come from or the colour of their skin.
Well, that concludes questions. And do you want to make any closing remarks, First Minister?
I don't think so. I'm scared I would be ruled out of order.
I could always try. Can I thank you very much, and can I thank my colleagues for their questions? And that concludes this meeting. Thank you.